Let's be honest, if you live in the UK and are under 35, then the housing situation here is a bit of a joke. Houses here in the UK are outrageously expensive to buy, and for a country that's actually obsessed with getting on the property ladder and home ownership, I'm here to give you a contrarian view as to why buying a house in the current UK property market may not be a good idea. So if you are interested, then keep watching. Hello and welcome to The Nimble Nomad. My name is Arjun and this is the channel where I talk about money and investing. So in case you are interested in topics such as personal finance, investing and money, then please consider subscribing to the channel. So I've done a fair number of videos about UK property, more specifically about my experience trying to help to buy property in London, which was actually a failed transaction, all the way to a more of a statistical and data-driven analysis between the pros and cons of renting versus buying, looking at the actual financial numbers of which works out. Now, if you're interested in any of those videos, I'll add links to them. But in this video, I actually want to talk about whether it actually makes sense to buy a property in the UK when the property market is absolutely red hot. Now, on a personal note, for me, the whole thought of owning a property actually only invokes negative emotion. But in this video, what I'm going to try and do is try and set that emotion aside and try and look at the data and facts to try and come to a conclusion on whether it makes sense to buy a property in the current environment we're looking at from an economic perspective. So the first thing that I actually want to talk about is asset valuations when it comes to houses. And the reason why this is important is because, like most people, when they buy a house, and this I'm talking about a primary home where you actually live. I don't necessarily agree with this theory, but people treat that home, even though they're living in it on a day-to-day basis, to be an asset and an investment. So setting aside any notions that I have around this, let's just consider for a second that this is actually a investment. And most people are under the assumption that investments, like all investments, houses actually in the UK appreciate over a period of time. Now, if you look back over the last 20 odd years worth of data, on average, house prices have increased about 4 to 4.5% after you've taken away inflation. And that's actually fine. But if you go back further in terms of history, that's not always the case. So the current average price for a UK home is at an all-time high where we're looking at £278,000 for a house in the UK. And the rate at which house prices have grown, especially over the last 2.5-3 years, is ridiculous. If you compare it to the history over the last 25 years, it's probably the highest they've grown. And so we're looking at a 13.5% growth rate for houses in terms of house price appreciation. Now, although there has been this almost tailwind pushing house prices up quite significantly over the last couple of years, this hasn't always been the case. So if you go back to the 70s or even to the late 80s, that was a very similar period where you had house price appreciation at almost similar rates or even higher. But what happened after that was basically you entered a period where house prices did not actually grow that much for about a decade. So between the 90s, house prices didn't grow at all. And this actually comes back to asset valuation. So like all assets, basically you can't have overvalued assets. They will basically come back down and normalize to the mean. So if I try to draw a parallel basically with other asset valuations which were through the roof, I can draw one directly with, for example, with tech equity. So if you looked at any of the technology stocks such as Google, Amazon, Facebook, all of these basically were through the roof in 2020 and 2021. And this was almost like a tech bubble which was building, and asset valuations just didn't match earnings. And what happened is in 2022, we've seen basically a big pop on this bubble, and you've seen asset valuations come down, which if you talk to people back in 2020, whether this was actually going to happen, people would just laugh at you. But we've seen in certain stocks where there's basically been 25-30% drops in some of the biggest stocks. I'm talking about FANG stocks in a single day. Now, this actually is quite relevant from a UK property market perspective because we have actually entered a high inflation era basically, and as a result of which interest rates are rising. And this brings me to my second point. UK inflation actually is hitting all-time highs, and we're looking at inflation rates which are at 40-year highs. Now, the last time we had high inflation, or inflation which was really high, inflation hit 7.5% in the late 80s. And the way most governments and central banks try to tackle inflation is by raising base rates, so the rate at which they are willing to lend to other banks. And at the start of this year, the Bank of England base rate was just 0.1%. And by June, so now we're at 1%. And this is quite a significant increase because we haven't had a 1% base rate since 2009. So it's a very significant period during which we have just had really, really low base rates. And the plan basically for like all central banks for the UK is to continue to raise the base rates until inflation is actually under check. Now, if I go back to the late 80s where inflation had peaked to nosebleed levels at 8%, the base rate for the Bank of England actually touched 14.8%. Now that actually seems almost unimaginable for a generation of people who have bought properties at ultra low base rates. And basically, this is where it becomes really important to consider this rise in base rates. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because Bank of England base rates or any central bank base rates are quite a significant factor when it comes to buying a property. So the base rate actually defines or determines how much your mortgage interest rate is going to be. And this typically is by the amount you look at the base rate, there's usually a percentage or a percentage and a half added. And that's how much you then end up borrowing on a mortgage interest rate. Now, the other factor that you want to look at is the total debt service ratio, or the TDS ratio. And this TDS ratio is basically, in simplicity, a factor by which the bank determines how much of your salary is considered in terms of paying back that mortgage. And the maximum that a bank will be willing to lend to you is at a 40%. Now, different countries have different rationalizations for this, but if 40% of your salary is going to be the mortgage, then they will not lend more than that. Now, this becomes really important because when Bank of England base rates rise, so too your mortgage and interest payments on your home that you've purchased as well. And if you get into a situation where basically Bank of England base rates have risen too significantly, it can be a scenario that a lot of people can't actually afford those mortgages anymore and they start selling. And when that selling starts, that means that house price valuations come back down because you're in a market where basically everybody's trying to sell. And so your house, especially you bought it at a peak valuation, may no longer be worth what you thought it would be. And you can't actually sell your property until you have the difference between what you bought versus what the house value is at the point that you're actually trying to sell. And this can mean that you get into a situation where you're in a underwater mortgage. And so the third factor that I actually want to talk about, and this is setting aside high interest rates and average UK prices, is the levels at which income growth is actually taking place. So the ratio between the average house price and average income in the UK at the moment stands at about 8.9. And just for context, in terms of relative terms, over the last 80 years, the ratio sort of deviated somewhere between 4.5 to 7.5. So basically, we're quite significantly off the average numbers here. And the other data point that I really want to bring out, especially with regards to this ratio, is the last time we hit this sort of a number as far as average price of a house to average income was just before the 2007 housing bubble burst. So the point that I want to make here is that, look, people are trying to buy homes that they may not necessarily be able to afford over the long term, especially if interest rates keep rising. So it's really important to consider your personal circumstances before committing to a 25 or 30-year commitment on a mortgage. For me personally, looking at all of the data points that the data is actually suggesting, it looks a bit sort of too early to start stepping in or stepping onto the property ladder. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to continue to watch and monitor the property market, especially in the UK. And who knows, we may end up in a situation where the bubble actually bursts. But whilst I'm waiting, I'm continuing to invest my money in the stock market. So my cash is not losing its value. So if you are interested, I make content about this as well. I'll add more links to the videos that I kind of make at the end of this video. But ultimately, what I do want to leave you with is I'm not against the idea of buying a property. It's just making sure that whatever you buy, it is an asset and the asset valuation needs to be at a reasonable price. So I hope this video helped you out, and if it did, please smash that like button and don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.